And I think this also sort of brings to my next question, which is really now trying to bring us into early childhood education. You're joining us right now as Vancouver, the lands where most of the people here are, we're just covered with smoke that came up from fires from the nation state now known as the United States of America. And I remember we gathered together in January in London, Ontario, and both you, Mindy, and Afrika were coming from fires. We're in a global pandemic. To me, and I could be wrong, but I'm just wondering if the world is responding to us, to how we are in the world, and the global pandemic and the speed in which it spread is a response to how we move in the world, almost thoughtlessly. And this is the world that our children are inheriting. So if we take seriously your work in the Commonwealth's Collective, and if we think about what Haraway calls our response ability, what are we now obliged to do differently pedagogically? What would you want us to walk away from this virtual conference and think about as we walk into our classrooms on Monday with the children? What does this mean for us in the pedagogical work that we're doing?
Let me start, Kathleen. I don't think that I will be able to tell you what you can do on Monday, but let me start by noting that when you say that the world might be responding to us, I actually think that the world is actually responding. I don't know if it's just to us, but it's responding and doing its own thing, right? What the world needs to do with what it has. I think it's responding to everything that we have left behind, that we are bringing in through our extractive logics and colonial logics and so on and so forth. I always am reminded by Stengers when she says that, you know, Gaia doesn't really care. So it just does its own thing, her own thing. But going back to your question, again, without giving you what we might be able to do, but I want to pick up on the idea of responsibility that you brought up in your question, and when you say responsibility, and picking up from the work of Donna Haraway, who also picks up on Derrida's work in her book, Companion Species. And I want to talk a little bit about this idea of responsibility, because as Kathleen, as you know very well, when we use it a lot, you, myself, and a lot of people here in Canada use it a lot. And more I am hearing people talk about this idea of responsibility. Oh, we just need to engage in responsibility. And I want to bring us back into how we are thinking with Haraway in the Commonwealth Research Collective about the idea of responsibility, that we're not necessarily referring to the idea that we are accountable to our own actions, which is in that liberal sense or in that humanist sense that Afrika was talking about. Haraway's point is not to impart a sense of individual moral obligation or of duty that we need to be individually responsible to the world and so on and so forth. Instead, what we mean, and again, drawing from her, is that we're she is acknowledging our dependency on more than human worlds, and also calling for the need to cultivate the capacity for a careful response, because we are dependent on more than human worlds. Like we mentioned before, like responsibility is a relational ethics and also a relational politics. And because of that, it needs to be enacted in our everyday practices as we are living in this messy world, in this messy common world, and without any certainties, right? And that is the tricky part of this idea of responsibilities, that there are not certainties at all. So in our pedagogical work, the pedagogical work that we are trying to nurture in the Commonwealth Research Collected is both learning how to respond and at the same time opening up possibilities for different kinds of responses. So to narrow down a little bit, or to focus a little bit on the idea of responding to and with the world, I think that this is important in pedagogy, because we are concerned with the collective, because there is so much at stake. Sorry, I am not articulating things very well. It is 11 p.m. or more than 11 p.m. for me. And I'm having trouble thinking through this, because there is so much at stake in our response. It's not just any response. It's not just giving anything, but because there is so much at stake, our pedagogical work needs to be slow, needs to be tentative, hesitant, as well as situated. And this is where I'm trying to bring in Stengers and Haraway talking with each other. And it needs to be slow, because we are not the only ones who is responding, as we can see right now in the pandemic and the fires and a lot of other disasters. And when we respond in a slow way, we need to be paying attention. And it matters a lot how we pay attention, because when we respond, we are affected and we also affect others. So we are in this relationship. We're always in a relationship, and it's never just about us. Our pedagogical work also needs to be tentative and even hesitant, like Stenger says, hesitant responses, because it is always this constant relay between what the world throws and how and the alliances that we have to make with what the world throws at us. Not that the world just, again, is thinking about us, but it just throws things. And we have to be in constant communication and create certain alliances along the way, and to not create certain alliances along the way. And also the pedagogical work that we need, that we are engaging in the Commonwealth, needs to be situated, because we are obliged to think with what happens, with what we have in front of us. So in this idea of responsibility, we are called to forget this seductive idea that we can apply theories in our practices. Instead, responsibility is calling us to think. And that's a very scary idea in early childhood education, particularly for educators, to have to think, to not have the answer at their fingertips that can readily apply to children. Pedagogically, it is about ensuring that we work with the troubled realities, with the common worlds that children have in front of them, making them palpable, making them alive. So it's not about teaching children how to feel good and to solve all the ecological problems that from a distance, right? And to be just to be good. And if we're just good, everything will be okay if we teach children how to be good citizens. Okay, so then I want to go back to this idea of opening up possibilities for different kinds of responses, to say that this is very important, that we have to open up possibilities, because we don't know what we don't know in advance what we might emerge, because we're never in control. And a pedagogical concern for the Commonwealth Collective is responding to the demands of the worlds. Sometimes when the partners that we have to respond are partners that we don't even know, we don't know how to relate with. Like, for example, thinking about some of the work that I have done with raccoons. How do we respond to raccoons who want to live in the playground that children also have to use, right? So it's learning to affect, and also to how to become affected by someone else. And it's this dance that we have to be in. And then in relation to opening up possibilities for different kinds of responses, we also have to open up possibilities for different kinds of stories that we put up in the world, out within the world. And we do this all the time with pedagogical documentation. And we talk a lot about pedagogical documentation in early childhood education. So it is then, in common worlds, is very much concerning how do we tell stories, and what are the stories that we're going to be told that might not be necessarily the stories that are expected within early childhood education. How will we ensure that the story that we tell through our pedagogical documentation is not necessarily caught into the narrative of progress, of efficiency, and growth that early childhood education is so committed to nowadays. So the stories that you will see and the pedagogical documentation that you will see from the common worlds will be very, very different, because we are trying to challenge, to tell other stories that are not yet stories that we have in early childhood education. That's why we use words and we use ideas that might not necessarily be intelligible to early childhood educators. But what we're trying to do is to push early childhood educators, not because we want to use these very difficult words, but because language is performative, because language does something. And we want to create other worlds through this language, like with the telling of the lively stories that Mindy was talking about. So it's important that the pedagogical documentation doesn't perpetuate the status quo, that doesn't perpetuate this nature-culture divide that Africa was talking about, but rather that it reconfigures, that it reframes, and even something that we do not do very well as in early childhood educators, but children do very well, and we tend to ignore, that speculate what might be other worlds that we need so desperately right now because of all the conditions that you talked about before. And here I come to the second part of your question, when you're talking about the idea of constructing livable worlds. Well, that is exactly the pedagogical intention that we have in the common worlds. It is about constructing and co-constructing livable worlds, not knowing what those worlds are, and knowing that we have to construct those unknown worlds with the messed up world that we have in front of us. We cannot take any shortcuts. And this is another problem of early childhood education, that is constantly trying to take shortcuts and is constantly trying to have this ideal world that creates with children.
If I was to ask, respond to Veronica, what I'm thinking about, as you said, we're obliged to think what is in front of us. So right now, we're obliged to think of this virus. It's not about pausing until the virus is over. It's not about trying to conquer the virus. It is about how do we in our classrooms live well together with a virus? How do we learn in our world to live well with this virus, to engage with others, to be joyful, to share ideas? But we're not, and I think that for me was a very powerful thing. We were obliged to engage in pedagogical practices, not waiting for the perfect conditions, not getting the children ready, but with what's in front of us.
Mm-hmm. Those are the common worlds, right? If we have something that is telling us something right now, is this virus, this pandemic, and children are not outside of it. We have to be doing something with children. We can't just pause. It cannot just be about sitting children with their masks and trying to control the classroom. Yes, of course, no one is saying that, children should be exposed to the virus or anything like that, but we can go on, and we have to go on. This is not the time to give up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
and I think
for me, the obvious thing about thinking with the virus is recognizing that we're not separate from the rest of the world, and we can't control and manage it the way we've been deluded to believe we can. And we're still sort of fighting at some level to try and reestablish that position. But the virus is winning, right? So I guess if there's anything that, I guess, if you want to frame it in terms of a battle, like so many leaders do. But to think with the virus outside of that sort of humans against the virus kind of combative notion, I guess it's to recognize, to kind of bring us down a peg, I suppose, to recognize our mutual vulnerabilities with and our entanglements with all other living beings and organisms on the earth, and to sort of get the sense that actually we're just a part of it. We're not the kind of masters of it. It's not ours. And I think this Gaia notion that Veronica mentioned earlier, which originally comes from James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis, it's a really useful concept, and it is one we could use with kids to kind of get a grasp on what's going on here, because what it means is, what it refers to is the fact that we live on a living planet. Our planet is alive, and it was alive way before we arrived on it. We're just the most recent newcomers, really, our species. And there's no guarantee we're going to be around all that much longer. And maybe the virus will be, or this one or another zoonotic one will be what gets rid of us. All the apex species in the past sort of end up getting knocked off. And why wouldn't we? We're part of something bigger than ourselves. We're part of a living world. Gaia is a word they give to it. It's not a as Stengers talks about, it's not a kind of comforting earth mother that's there to kind of suckle and protect and nurture us all. It doesn't give a shit. There's no morality in this. It's just a system. And when it gets out of whack, like it's completely out of whack now, the earth systems are destabilized, precipitated by our actions, right? And then it reestablishes trying to reestablish some new kind of balance, new kind of order. We get a virus that jumps a species barrier because life is opportunistic, as we're part of that opportunism. So it's not a moral thing. It's just this kind of system that's out of whack, that's out of balance. We're part of it. We can't escape it. And we're kind of wearing it right now. If ever there was a moment to kind of recognize our ecological subjectivities, now is the moment. Mm-hmm. We're not in control, and it's not our world.
But if we look at what is in front of us, and we think, as Veronica said, with children in speculative practices, we'd see other ways of being in the world. Maybe does the virus present to us, and this is not to suggest positive spin on it, but does it present to us an opportunity to how to think about living differently?
Well, it provides the opportunity for us to think about ourselves as ecological subjects, and one of many, not as masters, controllers, stewards, caretakers, managers, but as one of many who are mutually vulnerable, dependent, and that's a big lesson. And then when you look at the smaller interactions that are going on, say, with children and their worlds and their interactions with the worlds around them, you can see those kind of moments of different forms of relating and different kinds of world remakings and different kinds of worldings, and you can sort of grab onto them because a lot of them are really positive. They're not about controlling and managing and separating ourselves off. They're about, actually joining rather than separating. And I think, the big lesson from the virus is that we're definitely not apart from. We're very mortally vulnerable and within a big system that we're not in control of. And if you look at the way kids, little kids don't necessarily have that same kind of sense that they are or should be in control of everything. And if you look at the relationships that unfold for them, that are much more mutual and responsive and reactive, mutually sort of responsive and mutually effective, like Veronica was talking about, you can sort of grasp onto them as kind of minor sort of moments that are lessons of a different way of relating. Yeah. Just ones that don't separate us off. It's pretty simple in the end. Stop seeing ourselves as separate from the world. We're part of it. And we're not in control of it.
And with the virus, the pandemic, it was a big opportunity for us to rethink education. I think we have missed it.
I do too.
You want to say more about that? Because I agree.
Bruno Rachel recently wrote a piece called Facing Gaia, and I think it's a really good one. When I was in Vancouver, no, not in Vancouver, in Toronto, they'd just come out of the bushfires, and I was kind of traumatized from those bushfires. And I really felt that I just had faced Gaia. It's kind of shocking, that sense of being overwhelmed by something that's so much bigger than you that you just know you can't control. And that the virus is the next example of that. But the opportunity is to recognize that we're ecological beings. We're not individuals. We're not separate. That's basically it. And we're not in control. Facing Gaia moments are very revelatory. They're very uncomfortable, but they're very revelatory.
I also think about, how is it that we are talking with children, with young children, about the virus? Is it that war metaphor? Are we winning? Who is winning? Is the virus winning? Is it about continuing to separate and create that separation even stronger? Or is it about trying to think that we are very much connected with the world? What if we began to tell stories about that connection that we have with the virus, with children?
And I think it also creates an opportunity for us to make visible that young children do live not necessarily in pandemics, but they are always living in troubled, damaged worlds. And I hear that we often talk about children being traumatized by the virus as if all of the children coming into our classrooms had these pure and safe and wonderful lives. And I'm wondering if the virus is also an opportunity for us to remember that children's worlds, their common worlds, are messy and complex and contradictory, and they're also unequal.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's just us constantly trying to separate the child from the world.
And I do think that that is something that for us in early childhood and the Common Worlds Research Collective offers us an opportunity to really think, what does it mean when we think about children as being with and in the world, not as separate? And how then does our pedagogical practices need to change?